When I lived in New York, my apartment was over a laundromat business, and I picked up some evening hours there to get some extra money. It seemed like a chill job in the evenings since most of the action happened in the daytime. I was trained for 3 nights prior to being left on my own by a guy named Gary, who used to live in the building, who I'd occasionally see in the elevator, and of course when I did my laundry. He was quiet, rarely made eye contact, and looked to be in his 40s, with a beard and thick glasses. He was big into puzzles and would have all the pieces spread out across one of the folding tables during his shifts. By the end of the shift, he'd have it all finished and boxed every time. On the second night of my training, a twitchy-looking guy came in, and Gary told him to leave, staring at him until he did. He warned me to kick this guy out because he was chaotic. At the time, I remember thinking that was a weird way to describe him, but apparently he was mixed up with drugs and never actually did any laundry there. A few weeks later, the twitchy guy came back, clearly strung out, and gave me a hard time when I told him to leave. Since I wasn't Gary, maybe he was testing me? I don't know. He eventually left, and when I closed up, I left Gary a note letting him know what had happened, since he was scheduled to open to close the next day. Around noon on the day after I was off, I got a message from the owner of the laundromat asking me to come in early because Gary hadn't shown up to work, and more importantly to him, hadn't dropped off the nightly deposit the day before. I remember being pissed. The last thing I wanted to do was go in early and cover for someone else. When I got there, I noticed the mop bucket was still dirty and it reeked, which just made me more mad. I remember thinking I'd had to have a chat with Gary. I immediately checked the previous day's security footage to see what had happened. I saw Gary set up his puzzle and go back and forth between sitting there and then moving out of frame, with the steady whir of people coming and going throughout the afternoon, until it empties towards closing time. I was about to switch it off, bored of watching Gary sitting at his puzzle table, when the twitchy guy comes into frame and slams his hand on Gary's table. Gary looks up at him and says something, to which the guy flips the table, sending the puzzle pieces flying into the air, scattered all over the floor. Gary stands up and grabs the guy by the throat, slams him against the row of washers until the guy stops fighting. Gary is in frame, holding the guy like a rag doll by the neck, with blood pooling around their feet. Seconds tick by and he doesn't move. The guy's just hanging there by Gary's big hand until he drops him and turns to lock the front door. He walks back, calmly picks the guy up, and drags him towards the back, leaving a dark slick of blood in their wake. There were no cameras towards the back, so I have no idea what happened, but then Gary comes back, pushing the mop bucket, picks up his puzzle pieces all drenched in blood, and puts them back in the box and mops the whole area until there's no trace of blood. He pulls the cash out of the drawer and turns on the overnight lights. Then there's nothing until I come in. That's when I realized he might still be in the building, and I immediately dialed the police. I wanted to get outside, and I ran to the back door, but stopped short when I saw one of the big industrial dryers was still closed. We always leave them open when they're empty. I don't know why I did it, and to this day I wished I had just gone outside to wait for the police, but I had to see. My hands were shaking as I turned the latch. With a deep breath, I opened the door, and inside was the twitchy man, his broken skull smashed, his body bent unnaturally at the neck. I stumbled backwards and ran out past the dirty, stinking mop bucket full of dark, bloody water. Outside, I threw up while I waited for the police. I don't know if Gary just snapped or what, but it could just have easily been me in that dryer. He was so calm in the footage. He methodically put all the chaos back in order and then took the cash, which could only have been a couple $100. I don't know what happened to Gary, but his apartment was searched and he was gone. Presumably now living in some other apartment building, working some other job where he can do his puzzles and control the chaos. You never really know who you're living near or what can push them over the edge. In high school, I worked at a fast food place that was haunted. I had to see the weird things that happened there with my own eyes to actually believe it. The whole place had this unsettling energy that made my skin crawl, especially at closing time. On day one, the manager showed me around, pointing out the usual stuff, the fryers, the grill, the walk-in freezer. But throughout that first night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The dining room in particular gave me the creeps. Every time I stepped across the counter, it felt both charged and heavy, like something bad was about to happen. One of the older women that worked there, Sharon, would make the sign of the cross whenever she entered or left the building. I asked her about it one day, and she said it was to keep Jesus close and the demons away. I laughed until I realized she was serious. Boxes of supplies would just pitch off shelves with nobody nearby. Cooking utensils would go missing, only to turn up in bizarre places. Machines would just shut off on their own, and the lights even flickered from time to time. But the creepiest incidents occurred in the dining room. You'd put the chairs up to mop and turn around, and they'd be back down on the ground, lined in a row or scattered around the room, having made no sound at all. This would happen with the doors locked and the last few of us on shift in the kitchen. I finally asked Sharon what the deal was, hoping she could explain it as some pranks or faulty electrical wiring or something that would make sense. When she crossed herself, grabbed my wrist, and took me outside, I knew there was more to it. She said she didn't like talking about them inside, and then unloaded the whole story. A few years back, there'd been an attack just before close. She'd been cleaning in the dining room and saw the whole violent thing. 2 men were waiting for their order when a bunch of guys ran in and knifed them right there in front of the cash registers. One of the men died instantly, and the other didn't even make it to the hospital. Later, they found out the men had been brothers, both low-level dealers, and they'd crossed the wrong people over drugs. 2 lives in the same family just snuffed out in moments. Sharon said the men were evil, and she could feel their rage. She was honestly terrified of being in that building, especially at closing time. Her story made all the pieces fall into place, all the weird things I'd seen and felt, but until then I'd never believed ghosts could be real. Somehow their spirits lingered there, cursing the place, maybe reliving the trauma of that night. Maybe staying there was better than where they were headed, if you believe in those sorts of things. From that day on, I dreaded going to work, even for the few months I stayed, knowing that I was sharing that space with something I couldn't see. And as the strange occurrences continued, I could never shake the feeling that I was being watched. Nobody seemed to care enough to do anything about it. They just dealt with it. Management ignored it, but they never stayed until close either. The last time I drove past that building, the restaurant, if you want to call it that, was gone. In its place, in the same unmistakably shaped building of this big fast food chain, with the drive-through lane and all, was a pawn shop. I can only imagine the weird things that still happen there. Starting a new job is always a mix of nerves and excitement, right? Well, My first day at this admin temp job a few years ago would go way past that. Ironically, I would be temping at the temp agency. On my first day, I was given a stack of HR paperwork to fill out along with the office manual to read. Pretty dry stuff. The building was a bunch of offices along a main hallway, and this company used 2 offices on the same floor. The HR lady put me in the break room and popped in to check on me periodically. Her office was in the other office down the hall. When I hadn't finished the orientation paperwork by lunchtime, my temporary coworkers were forced to go out to lunch, leaving me alone in office number 1. Elena, the HR lady, told me she was taking her break, and when I was done, I could go to lunch. I was buried in the forms when I realized I was completely alone in the office. I didn't even know if Elena was down the hall anymore, but I noticed the calls were just going straight to voicemail. It was strange being alone in the office, a completely new place. It seemed irresponsible, honestly, to me. I could be anyone, a thief or some psycho. Aside from the phone ringing occasionally, the silence was deafening. I dove into the paperwork, wanting to get finished and go to break myself. I looked up when I saw something move in the reception area, which I could see from the table. Assuming it was Elena, I rushed through the last couple of forms and gathered up my stuff. I was so uncomfortable being there alone. I just wanted to get out of there. That's when I smelled someone smoking. I rounded the corner into the reception room to see a man in a suit. He was sitting in a chair with his back to me, smoking. As I entered the room, he turned and smiled. I smiled back at him and said, "Hello." His suit was immaculate, his hair slicked back neatly. He nodded at me, still smiling. I was so shocked to see someone smoking inside the building, I tried to think of something to say. "Can I help you with anything?" I asked, just trying to be polite. He took a long drag on his smoke and coughed quietly. He shook his head. "No, thank you. I'm just waiting for someone," and turned back around to face the wall. That's when I got goosebumps, and there was a fuzziness in my ears like static. I felt the need to get out of there immediately, and I did. As I passed the other office, I saw Elena at her desk and let her know I was going to lunch, but that there was a man in the waiting area. She looked at me confused, waved me goodbye, and hurried down the hall to see who was waiting. I was almost to the elevator when I heard her calling out, "Hello? Is somebody here?" I didn't hear anyone answer before the elevator doors opened. Once inside, I hit the ground floor button and listened to the dings as I descended past each floor, feeling the same dread I would feel as a kid. From directly behind me, I heard a cough. I closed my eyes shut, instantly recognizing the sound as the waiting room man's cough. The strong smell of smoke stung in my nose, and I knew I wasn't alone in that elevator. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal, especially when I was stressed. It was like they could just get through to me when my guard was down. I kept my eyes closed until I heard the last ding and the doors opened. I didn't want to see him again. They don't always stay looking fresh. Sometimes I wonder about that man and why he was there, waiting. I never went back into that building, but I think of him whenever I smell cigarettes.